So Moses Gorman is the last witness for the prosecution. He talks about talks about the kicks, as he doesn't know if it was, if it actually connected. He saw that John O'Brien kicked at Isaac Jackson, but doesn't know if the blow connected. He said that he didn't see any mark on Jackson's face, didn't see any torn whiskers. On the cross-examination, he says, he couldn't swear to it, but as far as he's aware, he didn't see it. And couldn't say that O'Brien was unarmed. But, again, so these are kind of key points. At this point, the trial adjourns for the day. When they come back the next day, the defense begins. And basically the defense that Mr. Tweedy is going to put forward is that John O'Brien is basically a brute. And while very very mild-mannered or even very nice, when sober, the fact that he's been drinking all day, he's known that alcohol does bring out a very negative side of him. So, we begin with the sheriff of Northumberland County, John Sheriff. And the sheriff basically lays out that, listen, I've got absolute trust in Isaac Jackson. I've used him as a constable before. I've never had a problem with him. It's very much a character kind of witness. He does say that Jackson gave himself up and all of this. Interestingly, on cross-examination, the Attorney General brings it out that while technically speaking, Isaac Jackson gave himself up, he did give himself up because the sheriff suggested, yeah, you better give yourself up. That would be the best thing to do in this situation. So it's a minor point, but I think I think that is probably somewhat important, and especially when really the sheriff's goal here is to lay out the gleaming character of Isaac Jackson. So that's it. George Burchell is the next witness. So George Burchell Jr. Originally, he is asked about John O'Brien, but he says he really doesn't know much about John O'Brien. He knows who he is, he knows him to see him, but he can't really make any commentary on his reputation. So one would think that maybe this is a point for the prosecution, but really what George Burchell is there for is to testify to a completely different episode. And again, he's very much kind of a character witness when you get down to it. George Burchell Jr. Witnessed sometime before the shooting, when Isaac Jackson was acting in his capacity as constable, that Isaac Jackson was assaulted and physically beaten by the Dolan brothers. Now, he lays out the scene where Jackson is sort of chasing down somebody, wanting to serve a warrant on them, so on and so forth. Basically the quarry, the person in question gets away. Basically sort of walks off and leaves Isaac Jackson. So the Dolan brothers sort of tease him and taunt him and say that he's a coward and so on and so forth. The thing becomes heated. The three men get into a fight, and Isaac Jackson, outnumbered 2-1, is roughly handled. So is physically accosted. So the underlying message here, which is going to come out in Tweedy's summation, is that Isaac Jackson is not, somebody who would arbitrarily use deadly force. And this case proves that, because again, he was beaten, but he didn't pull his weapon. He didn't, try to do anything of that nature. So again, that's really what it's all about. John Niven, a magistrate, is the witness for the defense after this. He does point out that, as far as he is aware, John O'Brien had a reputation of being very quarrelsome. But the cross-examination, the Attorney General was able to get him to say he only heard that. He can't say from his own knowledge. So that's interesting. Again, that's a bit of a clawback there, and some points then for the Attorney General. The last witness for the defense is J.S. Benson, who is a doctor. So Dr. Benson does kind of lay out Isaac Jackson's injuries, and basically corroborates everything that that Anthony Jackson had said. Says, that again his right eye is bruised. He has abrasions about his right temple. He's got bruises all over his body. He makes the point, and I think this is again very key to the defense's theory of what happened. He says that John O'Brien was much larger. He was a much bigger man than Isaac Jackson was. And the force with which he was, kicking at him, he could have very easily killed him. Now, again, obviously Benson was not there, but, from what he knows of the situation, he's able to draw these conclusions. So both sides then retire. The prosecution has already rested its case. The defense rests theirs. The prosecution, the Attorney General, wants to call rebuttal witnesses at this point to basically say that the beating occurred after the shooting. The defense objects. Mr. Tweedy basically says that you could have done that yourself back because you called Anthony Jackson. You could have brought, Patrick O'Brien or whomever. You could have recalled him to the stand, had him lay out, the series of events. And you could have called witnesses to that effect when you had the opportunity. You rested your case. It's too late now. The judge seems to agree with that and sort of moves to closing statements. So the closing statement by Tweedy, by the defense, basically lays out, again, the idea of you have three choices in this case. You can convict for murder, you can convict for manslaughter, or you can find that this was a justifiable homicide. So right off the bat, Tweedy basically says this, there's no evidence in this case to suggest that this was cold-blooded murder. That there would have to be some sort of malice aforethought there, and there's no evidence that Jackson had that. He did not come to Gitchell's store, or knowing that he was going to shoot John O'Brien. He had not prepared to do that. That's very clear as far as Tweedy was concerned, and the evidence again seems to kind of support that. So you have to decide now whether this was manslaughter or this was justifiable, and obviously Tweedy feels that it's the latter. He points out again what we've seen already from testimony about O'Brien, that he was kind of that he was quarrelsome, that he was dangerous when you get into liquor. He draws back to Susan Carroll's testimony, what was, I think, probably a heretofore ignored part of the testimony, that Susan Carroll went to John O'Brien when she was breaking this up. So the implication is that John O'Brien is the aggressor, and that's why she's going to him. That very well could be. It's an interesting point. So that's it, and that Jackson is entitled to the benefit of the doubt here. If there's any doubt in the minds of the jurors that that Jackson is entitled to it. Jackson was not somebody that would again use deadly force or willy-nilly. He only used deadly force in protection of his life. That his life was in danger and that there was only one chance, and and that's what he did what he had to do. He basically says that the punishment on Isaac Jackson is certainly going to be there for the rest of his life. He's going to have to live with the fact that he killed somebody. So again, he kind of lays all that out. So I think, and this is a very these are all very valuable points. Interestingly, he also says, which again is I think a real leap, but again I suppose he can say it in his closing statement. He says that he believes that O'Brien had a knife. Where does that come from? I mean, the most anybody can say is that it was possible, and they won't swear that that he didn't have something. But nobody saw that. It seems like I say, it seems a bit of a jump, if not, at the very least, a pretty big step, if not a jump. So, like I say, but again, it's definitely kind of putting more onus back onto John O'Brien. The Attorney General's comments were not recorded in the newspaper. Apparently they were too long. So we don't know what the Attorney General had to say. We don't know what the judge had to say when he charged the jury. And again, I think if I was the Attorney General, I certainly would be pleased with that. Regardless of what I said in my closing statement, the judge's charge to the jury basically, definitely helps the prosecution's case. So he says, basically, you've got to decide, that The witnesses are conflicting, but that's certainly understandable. That we've got, it's something that happened, it wasn't planned, it was something that happened in the spur of the moment, and everybody's trying to agree, trying to kind of come to grips with it as best they're able. So, he does mention, though, which I think is a very important point, and something that nobody's touched upon yet, that Isaac Jackson is carrying a gun when he's a private citizen. He's not there. He's not executing warrants. He's not doing anything official. He is not, he is, in strict point of fact, he is not a constable at that moment. He's a private citizen who happens to be armed. So, he kind of puts that in there, which I think is an important point, but, not something that was really brought out in trial. He probably even more, explicitly, I mean, he comes right out and he says, that he personally, the judge, does not believe that Jackson was in fear of his life, and that manslaughter is the very least that you can find, is the very least verdict that you can find. So I mean, to me, that's pretty wild. I mean, if you're on the jury and the judge is telling you, yeah, in my opinion, you know what I mean, he's guilty of manslaughter, that's got to be at least a little prejudicial. But again, I don't know, what kind of leeway a judge was given in those days versus what you could have today. And maybe that's something the judge could say at any time. I'm not entirely sure. But again, it seems to me a pretty clear directive. So the jury retires, and the jury is out for about 3 hours. They retire at 4, they come back in at 7. And basically, so the foreman, W.S. Brown, reads the verdict that Isaac Jackson is guilty of manslaughter, but the jury puts in a strong recommendation for mercy. So the judge sentences him to 2 years in the provincial penitentiary in Dorchester for this conviction of manslaughter. The jury talks about it afterward in the newspaper, and they basically say that when they went in, they voted right away, and it was 7-5 in favor of manslaughter. So there were 5 individuals who did want to vote to acquit on the grounds that this was a justifiable murder, or justifiable homicide, I guess we'll say. So both sides kind of laid out their claims. Nobody was moved, and basically the 5 said that they agreed that Jackson should be punished in some way. What they weren't clear on, or what they felt, I guess what gave them pause, was that they were afraid that Jackson would receive a long sentence. And they didn't want that. They didn't think that was justified. The 7 basically said, listen, that's not really our job. But they came to terms. And they basically agreed that the 5, they would all vote to convict, provided there was a strong recommendation for mercy. And that's what they did, and that's what they got. So at the end of the day, there you have it. I mean, throughout this whole process, I think we really saw a big change in the trial. I think it was something that, changed how we saw this entire event. The testimony and everything else that kind of came into it really there were a lot of details that weren't a part of that earlier testimony that definitely came out and definitely changed how this whole thing shook out. So that's basically that story as best as I know it. So that's where we leave things today. Next week I'll be back again, but right after this I'm gonna put up a poll, so I'm gonna let you decide what we talk about next week. So, and of course, if you've got other ideas and other things, definitely leave them in the comments below, and they could be part of a future poll as well. So thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this or found it interesting at the very least, and we'll see you next week.